Well, today we've been talking, and we've been in 2 Corinthians for the last few weeks, and we're talking about some of the authentic markers of discipleship. We're not exhausting the list. We're looking at some of the ones that occur in 2 Corinthians as Paul is telling and defending his own reputation in the book against the Corinthians or against people in the Corinthian church. And so, again, you can start to open. We'll be in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 today, and so you can kind of start opening your Bibles there. It'll be up on the screen here in just a minute. But today we're talking about authentic strength. And now, this pot, I bought a pot with me today, just a basic pot, maybe a little more decorated. I couldn't find one a little more plain. It isn't flashy. It has some practical purposes, putting a plant in it or doing a few other things with it, I suppose. This pot is not what you would call your typical symbol of strength and value, like worth a lot, right? It may be worth $10. I mean, there's some of you, if I said, I'm going to put this up for sale today, you might give me $10 for it, right? But how many of you would give me $10 for it when I break it? Anybody? All right. No, I'm not really going to do it. That's way too much mess. And probably would shatter and bust and hit my eye or do something silly like that. Now, when estimating value, we instantly think of practical concerns, right? We think of beauty, aesthetics. There's different reasons that we might value a pot like this. But if it's broken, there's not much value to it. There's really not many practical. It's not going to look good. There's going to be no resale value, no flash, no beauty. But if you had given me $10 for this pot, and I had broken it, and you had said, I'll give you $10 for that broken pot, you would have had at least 2 silver coins in the rubble. So $40. You would have quadrupled your money because all that you were looking at what was on the outside of the pot. I didn't give you a hint yet that you knew what was inside the pot. It's what we do, right? We look on the outside. We look at what we can see. We don't imagine, well, this came from the pastor. He really wouldn't rip me off, would he? No, I wouldn't rip you off. There would be something of value in here if I took your $10. And God's going to say something similar. He says, your life is going to have a lot of breaks. It's going to have a lot of busted up stuff in your life when you serve me. But you're not going to walk away empty-handed. And that's going to be basically what we're going to talk about today. See, if this was my bank, though, you would think, most people in the world would think I'm a fool. Is that correct? If this was my bank, I would put my money, these aren't stored in here at my house, right? Let's just put it that way. We store things in safes. We put things in what we think are strong. Now, people really still want shiny things when they think about God. They want safe things. They want to think about how beautiful it is. You know, they want music. They want fanfare. They want to see when they say, "Oh, is God in that? Is he working in that person? Is he working in that church?" They look for these dramatic, shiny, beautiful, wonderful things. They think that God works through the most talented, through the most gifted, through the flawless, through the dramatic speakers, through the best singers and instrumentalists. Now, you're probably not guilty of that just simply because I'm here and you're there. It's a joke. Apparently, that proves the point that I'm not a gifted speaker, therefore you are not having that problem. But the church in Corinth complained because Paul was not a good enough speaker, because he was getting bashed around, because his life looked like a broken pot. And they're like, you're just not strong enough. You're not good enough. You know, how quickly, he says, we can confuse Paul saying our strength and God's strength. But God entrusts Paul because he is weak. And that's what we're going to look at Paul's argument and what Paul's discussion this morning. See, Paul is not a superhero. God works more gloriously because Paul gets physically, mentally, and emotionally broken down sometimes by his own strength. So let's read what Paul has to say about earthen jars and 2 Corinthians chapter 4. We're going to read 7 through 18. 7 through 18. So here thank you for putting that up. The main point, authentic discipleship shows the strength and endurance of God's glory. That's the main thesis for this morning. It's the main point. Let's read what Paul has to say in 2 Corinthians 4, 7 through 18. But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, so that the surpassing greatness of the power will be of God and not of ourselves. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not despairing, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying about in the body the dying of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our body. For we who live are constantly being delivered over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh. So death works in us, but life in you. But having the same spirit of faith, according to what is written, and this is from Psalm 116, he's quoting from, I believed, therefore I spoke. We also believe, he says, therefore we also speak, knowing that he who raised the Lord Jesus will raise us also with Jesus and will present us with you. For all things are for your sakes, so that the grace which is spreading to more and more people may cause the giving of thanks to abound to the glory of God. Therefore, we do not lose heart. But though the outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being renewed day by day. For momentary, light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. While we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. It's the word of the Lord this morning for us. First of all, disciples display God's strength. It's very simple. Disciples display God's strength. See, Paul equates the gospel, again, that's why I was doing this. He equates the gospel with a great treasure and himself as a clay jar. We're not talking about, this is probably too beautiful of a jar to really get across the point. We're not talking about a beautiful Grecian urns that you might see in a museum. We're talking about the pot shards that are found in archeological sites today, where there are just millions of them everywhere. We're talking about what were basically the paper plates of the ancient world. They're just earth that's pushed together and cooked and kilned in the fire for just very practical use. We're not talking about the expensive ones that you might, again, have beautiful paintings on. They have different words for that. It was so common that they would actually, I'll do a lot of archeological reading. It's one of my favorite things. They would actually, when you find pot shards, you look at the pot shards to discover what their daily life was like. Because a lot of times when a jar broke, they would write something as simple as their grocery list on these shards. That's how common Paul is calling himself. So he's basically calling himself the paper plate of the ancient world. That's as close as I can get to our minds. It's ordinary, it's unimpressive, and breaks easily, just like you and me. So therefore, it's the treasure inside that matters. As poetic as this verse sounds, gentlemen, I want to warn you here. And I say that. It's the treasure inside that matters, right? I know it sounds poetic when I say that, guys. Do not get any wise ideas about using this scripture to describe your wife's inner character. Again, I'll advise you, do not tell her that her heart is like a treasure kept in a plain old mud pot. Right? Unless you want to see if your head is harder than a clay pot. If you get that, then you get the point of what Paul is saying here, how much he's diminishing his self right in this spot. You know, if you understand then you'll understand that the other way, let's put it this way, the other way misses the point is that this treasure, in other words, if you're saying and you use that joke and to come off that joke, the treasure is not, inside is not you. It's not what's inside of you that's the treasure. It's not your inner character. It's not your willpower. It's not your thoughts. It's not your tenacity. It's not your fortitude. It's not your inner strength that Paul is saying is the treasure that's inward. Because every iota, every tiny aspect of you is brittle and worthless without God. I know that sounds harsh. From dust to dust. For if there is no God, you're nothing but dust and electrical sparks. It's worthless. Even the inner aspect of who you are is just crumbly and electric sparks and all that. Science, basically, if you don't believe there's God, if there's nothing else other than that, that's all you are. It's all we are. The earthen pot is anything. So let's describe a little bit better what Paul's saying. He's saying that the earthen pot is anything that's of this age. Anything that's of this age. Every aspect of you that's breakable and corrosible and corrosive, anything that's corruptible, all of those things are the broken pot. He's not just talking about your physical flesh. He's saying every aspect of who we are is a broken pot. And that the treasure is anything that he provides us from the age to come, from heaven itself. It's the heavenly gifts and grace that he puts in our lives that is the treasure. Does that make sense? Are we staying with me here? This is not as easy as most people think of that inner treasure. They're thinking of something in themselves and of themselves. He's talking about what comes from God. It's like heaven's strength shining through the cracks in your life and the cracks in your brokenness inside. All those things that are breaking inside of people and around us, that's what God is shining through. And we love these verses because of this, right? I love these verses, especially 8 and 9. They're famous verses. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed. Perplexed, confused, but not despairing. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. You see, today, as I read these, there's two problems, there's two issues that you can mess this up with. And you try to live this wonderful life of 8 and 9 where you face these challenges and you have this wonderful outcome or this outcome Paul talks about. But today, our world and our churches need to get this. Need to get 8 and 9 right because we're full of snowflakes and brickheads. All around us, we're surrounded by and often fall into being either a snowflake or a brickhead. Each of them despises the other. Now, snowflakes, like pansies, cannot take the heat, right? We know that. People laugh about snowflakes all the time. Those people are snowflakes. It reminds me, again, of snowflakes try to create a world that doesn't hurt, right? That's basically what we're getting at, a world that doesn't hurt. When harm comes, God isn't good. His power isn't real. The Corinthians think God's people should live in some kind of safe space. They are simply in denial, Paul's saying. That's not real life. That's not life as a disciple. The world, in all of its sin, is not your safe space. You might have it. It's fine to have a safe space and safe times and safe people in your life. There's times for Sabbath. There's times to have a sanctuary moment in your life. But the world outside is not something that you're going to make into a safe space. In fact, you're going to be afflicted. You're going to be perplexed. You're going to be persecuted. And you're going to be struck down if you're a disciple. That's what he's saying. There's not room for snowflakes. Paul uses the words, again, those words. And he says, you better expect it to happen. Better expect it. You're not going to make the world a soft pillow. See, God's power shines in contrast to it, to this world, to unveil it. It has to be bad and corrupt in some sense so that we can see how glorious and wonderful God is in light of it. It's kind of like shining light in the darkness. If you never feel anything bad, you would never know what anything good is. But Paul is also saying, I'm not a brickhead. I'm not a jar that's just pottery all the way through. I'm not just some brickhead, and brickheads believe in themselves. Brickheads say, I can get through anything by my own strength and by my own power. They're warriors, maybe, if they like to clash and fight. Maybe they're stoics who have this kind of idea that I can endure anything by the strength of my own mind to deal with it. Those are brickheads. We're all probably tended, again, I've said this many times, we're all tended to one thing or the other generally. I'm more tended towards being a brickhead. And I'm guessing many of us are probably more tended toward being brickheads. Maybe some people are more tended to being snowflakes in here. But it's basically saying I'll use my strength, my inner strength, to fend off the world. Nothing's going to hurt me. I'm going to overcome it, anything. In fact, if you do try to hurt me, I'm going to make sure I get revenge on you and take it back out on you to balance it. I'll show you my power. That's the brickhead, right? Paul says it's not like that either. He goes, I'm not like that at all. Most of us, again, are inclined to one or the other. Can you identify which one you're probably more inclined to? Paul says, my brokenness, he's telling the brickheads, my brokenness is real. It's painful. It's sorrowful. I'm not ignoring it. I'm not saying by my own power I'm going to overcome it. Because he's saying without God, he would be overwhelmed by everything he's gone through. He says, God shows his strength through my brokenness so that he can overcome the world when I cannot, even if I cannot. He's not even going to try to. When he says, I'm not crushed, I'm not despairing, I'm not destroyed, and I'm not forsaken, it's because God is here. It's an important aspect for us to get right in our lives. See, disciples are neither snowflakes nor brickheads. Just put it simple. They are broken for God's glory to shine God's own glory out from them, through the cracks, through your brokenness. God puts his glory in breakable vessels to show that the treasure has nothing to do with the pot. Does that make sense? He puts his treasure in vessels so he could basically, he's saying God is so powerful and doing such mighty things, it's obviously not me doing it. The treasure has nothing to do with the pot. The pot is just cooked mud. So all that really matters is its contents. That's what he wants the world to know. Paul's saying it's not about me, it's about what God's doing in me, through me, and to the whole world. Now, how often do you think, man, if those people would just toughen up, if those people were tougher, I think the same thing sometimes. I guess it's kind of natural. But that's not the gospel of Jesus. That's the gospel of the brickhead. If you're going to go around teaching and preaching the gospel of the brickhead, you will go around breaking people, and most likely you might go around making snowflakes. This is how this works. If you're a snowflake, Paul's basically would be calling you an empty pot, hoping that people just don't challenge you. How many of you fear being challenged in your life? How many of you fear being called by God to do something in your life? And you're like, I'm not a snowflake, I've done all these things, but God, oh man, God don't call me to do something. I can face the ranch, I can face the work, I can face physical labor, but God, don't call me to do something because I don't have what it takes. Don't be a snowflake, is what Paul's saying. He's not a snowflake, and he doesn't expect the Corinthians to be either. See, the snowflake also imagines, both their real life and in their spiritual life, that if someone bumped into them, they would break. Their spirituality is fragile. Their life is fragile. Maybe their emotions or mental state are fragile. And then you'll be preaching a false gospel of freedom. And you'll be saying, you need to all be free just so that nobody touches you because you don't want anybody challenging you. So you scream this word out in all the wrong ways and wrong meanings of the word freedom. And you preach a false freedom, scared to death, again, that someone's going to shatter you. When you act like a brickhead or a snowflake, you deny God's power in your life. When you either say, I'm not going to get involved, I'm not going to be called, or you say, I'm going to do it my way with my power, you've denied God's power, God's calling, God's voice in your life. It's one of the quickest ways to know in your own spiritual life why you're having such a difficult time. Because we're very quickly tend our way one way or the other. You need the strength and the tenacity of God in your life. Paul says Jesus has shown us another way to live with strength and with compassion. The way of Jesus. That's the third way. That's the way between the snowflake and the brickhead. A life of strength and compassion, the way of Jesus. See, life and death are the pattern for authentic disciples. Very important. Life, this may be the most missed aspect of Christianity in the world. Life and death are the pattern of an authentic disciple. Now, you can reference 10 through 12. So if you have your Bibles open, you can see what I'm talking about there. You can glance at that. Disciples don't just agree with God. They don't just preach God and teach God, but they live it. They live the gospel. See, the gospel is not about just going to heaven. It's about how to live powerfully and lovingly today. It's for now. It becomes every breath in, every breath out, the gospel. See, disciples die daily. That's what Paul's saying. He says, I die always carrying about with me the dying of in the body, the dying of Christ. Disciples die daily, and God's resurrection power is available daily. He's reinformed. Last week we called it transforming us, renewing us. Paul is the suffering apostle of a suffering Messiah. He's not saying Jesus suffered so I don't have to. He says, I'm suffering like Jesus suffered so I can live and have resurrection life in my life just like Jesus had in his life. And if you miss this aspect of the gospel, you're going to have you're basically going to be living in an empty pot. You're going to be a snowflake or a brickhead. You're going to be missing out on what it means to live now and today in Christ. Paul always does theology. He takes what he's trying to say and he theologizes it here. That is an incredibly important aspect. See, the glory, the power of God pours forth from Paul. It gleams through his brokenness as brightly as from the Easter tomb. He's trying to show that same glory that raised Jesus up in his own life. See, God fortifies us the more we die to ourselves. Glory, I think I mentioned it last week. Glory means a couple of things, but one of the main things it means literally is heavy. It means heavy. Paul carried a heavy load, is what he's saying. I carried a heavy load far beyond my own strength. But God's glory comes with a strength. It gives him the strength to carry the heavy load he's carrying because he's doing it for Jesus. See, Paul couldn't suffer and die beyond God's power to prevail in his life. Two things concern you when you reconcile your bank statement, right? There's two real columns that when you're doing your bank statement and you're looking at how much money you have, you see money in and money out, right? That's all that concerns us, most of us. If you're like Ashley, there's a whole bunch of other things that go in line when you're doing financials. But for me, it's money in, money out. Money in is good. money out, kind of hurts, right? We don't like that. So if you're spending too much, you do in your bank statement, and for that month you've spent way more than you've brought in, you're in the red. And if that continues, you're going to find yourself overdrawn. You're going to find yourself having in the red completely in your bank statement, overdrawn. That's a bad day, isn't it? I don't know if you've ever been overdrawn in your life. I was pretty young 20s. I think one time it happened to me for a short period, and man, it was just this horrible feeling to know that you're overdrawn. You know you're going to have to change your lifestyle. You're going to have to change your habits. You're going to have to find another income stream. Something's got to change. See, but we all also have little balance sheets in our hearts and in our minds when it comes to any kind of relationship, even a relationship with God. And what I'm putting into this, am I getting enough out? And if you don't understand this particular passage, you're going to be suffering. You're going to be going through hard times in life. You're going to think, oh, I'm following Jesus. I'm doing some things. But before long, you're overdrawn. Because you haven't actually, you're brickheading it, right? You're just trying to do it with your own power, with your own force. And before long, you don't have his strength undergirding what you're doing. And if it doesn't take long before you go, you know what, this relationship just isn't worth it. I'm not getting enough from it as I'm putting into it. And Paul says, the treasure that God has for his disciples who are being obedient to him far outweighs what he's putting into it. You might suffer, but you'll never be overdrawn. In fact, Paul says, the more lavishly he pours out his energy and his desire and his love for God, the more God pours in God's own energy, desire, and love into Paul's life. So that God gives heavenly life, the more Paul pours out his temporal life. That's kind of getting into verse 16 and 17 if you're following along in the text. God will never let him be overdrawn. God multiplies Paul's investment in the kingdom. The question is simple. Are you spinning your wheels? Are you detached, weary, and worn out in your spiritual life? Now, this doesn't imply burning yourself out. You're not supposed to do that. There's such a thing as Sabbath. The question is whether or not you're being obedient to his calling in your life. You can work for a king. Paul said, I work for a king with all the resources of heaven and earth to complete his task. And when I'm working for him, he gives me the resources in abundance. The authentic disciple depends on God's strength every day. If you're following along in the text, you'll see, I believe it's in verse 15, he quotes, it might be 13, he quotes Psalm 116 in verse 13 because he thinks it describes his life. I'm not going to sit here and break down Psalm 116 for you. I'd encourage you to go read it this week and see how and why Paul puts his life, he reads his own life into 116. And it's a good way to understand for yourself how to read the Psalms. And he basically says, what's happening in Psalm 16 is what I'm living. That's what he's saying in verse 13. The very aims of God are progressing here in Psalm 116. The very aims of God are progressing in Paul's own work. That's what keeps him, that's one of the things that he sees keeps him going. And he says, all for the glory of God that he's doing this. He sees that it's working. God's glory is working itself out. All for the glory of God. If you look at verse 15, it carries the very essence of divine and saint relationship. I've talked about this many times. Grace and gratitude. What does a relationship with God look like? It looks like verse 15. Grace and gratitude is something I've talked about, a half a dozen times, so I'm going to keep it short. And I'm going to say that Paul sees people around him and through his work entering into a deep, meaningful relationship with God. They are praising his name as he pours out his grace and endless gifts into their lives. See, the treasure of the grace cannot be earned. This treasure, God says, Paul knows, this treasure cannot be stolen. It can't be earned. God wishes to actually share the treasure that's in the pot. He's not trying to hide it. Because he's so full and so wonderful and has so many resources, you don't have to hide it. This is why he puts his treasure in jars of clay rather than in a safe. That's why he doesn't just put it in the hands of the powerful. That's why he doesn't just put it in the hands of the great speakers and the great singers and the people who seem so talented that, man, I could never carry God's glory like they do. It's baloney. It's God's glory, not yours. So don't lose heart. Don't lose heart as a church. Don't lose heart as a family. Don't lose heart as an individual. He says we do not lose heart. Because when we're working for God, though the outer man is decaying, though I am breakable, he renews me inside day by day. And then he says this wildly, I wish I could almost do a sermon. I thought about just doing this sermon in verse 17. It's a full sermon in itself. It says, momentary light affliction producing in us an eternal weight of glory. I want you to just think about that. That is weird. Affliction is a producing glory. Not my strength. He's not saying, what we like to say is one step at a time, right? And you'll get some kind of victory. No, he doesn't say that. Because that would be like one little victory. Okay, have one little victory in your life. Have another little victory in your life. And you'll finally reach this place of glory where you always wanted to be on top. He says, no, it's affliction. It's getting beaten down. It's getting cracked. It's getting broken, which is producing in you an eternal weight of glory. God inverses our suffering for his glory. He reverses it, you might say it that way. Dealing with temporal suffering produces eternal, weighty heaviness. It should mean that the least talented and the weakest are the most useless. That's how we think of it in our world. But Paul says God inverses the issue. The weaker you are, the less that you're trying to bring to the table by your own power, the more useful you are to the kingdom. He can use each of you to produce his eternal weight of glory, not because you're flashy, not because you got it all together, not because you've studied a ton or have an education, not because you have a beautiful voice, but because he created you, loves you, and produces for you your strength. And he shines his glory through your life. You know, in the church that raised me, there was a sweet little old lady. She would get up every Sunday morning before, I think it was before Sunday school, and she would read out the names and the countries of the missionaries with birthdays every week. She prayed for them, and she was a dear lady. I didn't know a single missionary at that point, but they seemed like heroes living exotic lives for God. That's kind of how I pictured it in my mind, and I imagined them as academically prestigious, endlessly creative, incorruptible, flashy speakers, and living these kind of idealized lives for God. And I took a trip to Africa in the year 2000, into my freshman year of college. And I met many African missionaries, and probably some of them I had heard their names when I was a child. And I mean no insult, but they seemed more normal than I really imagined at first. They were ordinary. They knew fear. They knew anxiety. They knew real pain without always knowing what to do about it. Sometimes feeling lost and what they should do next. They feared for their children. Their preaching abilities lacked flash. And several lacked expected leadership skills. Now, please remember, they had these skills. I imagined them as superhero versions of those things. Realizing they were normal, fragile, imperfect people loving God for Africa gripped my heart forever. They didn't try to act like Superman. They weren't Wonder Woman, not to me, not to the locals. They were strong, but they would cry as they thought about their family in the States. They had more failures than successes, they told me. That's just part of being in ministry. That's part of talking about Jesus. It's part of sharing that life of Jesus. I thought God only called people who were the best speakers, the unshakable, the problem solvers, and those who had it all together. But they just suffered alongside people while shining brightly God's glory. As you can see before you today, He calls before you ordinary people to serve Him. And He's calling some of you to be broken jars. To decide, I'm not a brickhead or a snowflake. It's not your destiny. It's not your fate. He says, I'm calling you to suffer in where you're at in life, to take on some brokenness, to love on some people, because loving on people and loving on broken people and hurting people hurts. Because hurt people hurt people. And He's calling you today and saying, trust my strength. Some of you may be suffering already right now. Some of you may be in different stages of life where you're already feeling broken and down. Maybe your life is not working out for you. Maybe the job isn't going well. And He says, I'm right here. Quit banging your head on the wall of your problems and open up to me and I'll show you my glory. God this morning wants to show you His glory, and He wants you to take that out and show His glory to the world around you. Not so you can say how good I am, because you'll know at that point you're not. You'll say how amazing God is working in your life. If you want to connect to God again this morning, I encourage you to say that to yourself. Say, God, I want to show me your glory. Show me your power and strength in my life. I want to be an authentic disciple for you.